The US is suggesting, together with NATO, that this is defensive rather than offensive. Mr. Felgenhauer, do you think Russia buys that idea?
Well, it's understood well in Moscow that at present this missile defense base in Romania does not actually seriously threaten the Russian nuclear strategic deterrent. But there is a fear, and it has been expressed also by the Russian President Vladimir Putin, that this may be not just simply missile defense, that under the guise of missile defense against Iran, and actually a double-use base is being deployed in Romania, which may be used for a first decapitating strike against Russia, basically to knock out the Russian political and military leadership.
All right.
So that's seen as very serious, that's seen as undermining the INF treaty, and that's right now most likely seen as the main threat. It's the double use of this base.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the points you just raised. Mr. Kulesa, targeting Iran, really? I mean, Iran has just signed a deal with the P5+1, and it seems that the implementation process is going on. So why targeting Iran? If targeting Iran, that would be going against the principles of that specific agreement. Mr. Kulesa.
Well, no, let's remember that the whole project did not start yesterday. That in the early 2000s, there were actually projects and reports which predicted that Iran would pursue both nuclear weapons to the very end and having nuclear weapons, and also developing the ballistic missile program going through intermediate range to even intercontinental missiles capable of striking the United States. So we had actually the projections which justified the development of the system. Right now, you are absolutely right saying that the things look good on the nuclear side, but let's remember that Iran continues developing ballistic missiles, and there are also other countries in the region that right now have or can have in future similar ballistic missile technology.
Okay, let me have Mr. Felgenhauer to respond very briefly to what Mr. Kulesa just said.
As I said, this is Moscow does not see Iranian threat or any other Middle Eastern country threatening Romania. So the question is against whom this is aimed. The answer in Moscow is it's aimed against Russia, and that this may be actually an attack base, and that, as Putin said, these defensive interceptors can be replaced by offensive nuclear-armed missiles, and Russia will not know when that happens. And there's a belief that it's actually targeting Sochi, which is de facto the summer capital of Russia, where Putin and his leadership spend many months.
Of course, that's serious business. But what about double use? Let's have Ambassador Volker from the US to respond to that. Double use technology.
Well, thank you. Right, thank you. What I appreciate what Mr. Felgenhauer is saying. Because if any of what he is saying were true, it would be worrisome. It would be worrisome for Russia, and it would be, frankly, worrisome also in the United States, because it could raise tensions and increase the risk of conflict. But fortunately, none of it is true. And I know it doesn't matter how many times the Kremlin says it, it still doesn't make it true. These are defensive weapons. The technology is very well known and very publicly seen. It is firing a small missile that does not have a warhead, that intersects with a kinetic effect an incoming missile, and by doing so destroys that missile. That's what the nature of the system is. It's not an offensive system, it's not a strategic system, it's not a system that can target ground targets. It is a system that is aimed at defending against small numbers of missiles that could be coming in.
All right.
With respect to Iran, Iran has signed the nuclear deal with the P5+1, which restricts activities concerning nuclear enrichment and slows down the creation of nuclear weapons. It has a sunset clause of about 10 years.
Yeah.
It says nothing about missile technology, and Iran, in fact, has been testing missiles even since this deal was signed.
All right, but let's focus on what you have just said, Ambassador Volker. You said that's likely if double use. It's likely to create tensions between Russia and the West, even Russia and the United States.
There is no double use.
Yeah, okay, all right. You just said it is no double use. Therefore, it is no tension because that's the tension that Washington wants to avoid with Moscow. But I have to ask: is it really that tension that Washington wants to avoid with Moscow? We've seen that tensions going on in Syria. We've seen that tension going on in Ukraine. If you want me to go on with the list, there are still a number of other places that I can say as well. It seems that Washington is not shying away at all with tensions against Moscow, but rather very actively participating, if not creating some, at least as Moscow sees it. Ambassador Volker.
Yes, but again, this is all Russian action. Russia invades Georgia, Russia invades Ukraine, Russia annexes Crimea, Russia threatens ships with nuclear attack, Russia does mock bombing runs against Stockholm or London. So, it is hard to avoid rising tensions when Russia is behaving that way. At the same time, it is not our goal, as Ash Carter and as President Obama and others have said. Our goal is to actually work together with Russia on peace and stability. Russia's behavior, unfortunately, is quite the contrary.
Well, peace and stability in whose term? That's an interesting question. And therefore, let me go back to Mr. Felgenhauer. Earlier, Ambassador Volker listed a huge, long line of so-called guilts, as Washington sees it, of Moscow. What do you make of these quote-unquote guilts?
Well, it's a serious problem because there is no right now trust at all between Moscow and Washington, and arms control and arms restraint is based on trust. And if there's no trust, I mean, the Americans can say as much as they wish about that this is not double use. The Russian generals will say to the Kremlin, we have secret reports and intelligence that it is double use. So it's going to be pushed back and forth, and the tension is going to rise, and maybe the last vestiges of arms control are right now really threatened with the INF treaty. And there is some pressure from the military-industrial complex in Moscow on the Kremlin to abandon INF and maybe actually resume nuclear testing. That's also a possibility. And that's not good for anyone.
We've seen a lot of debates already among our three panelists. We need to make sure that our audience really understands this kind of plan that we're talking about here. So let's take a look at some of these graphics if we can. Back in the year 2009, U.S. proposed a plan to include Europe in its missile defense shield system. Phase 1 of the plan was to complete it last year, where 4 Aegis-equipped battleships were deployed off the coast of Spain. Experts say this covers the entire Mediterranean. Phase 2 of the system is land-based and located in Romania, with an ambitious aim to cover the Black Sea. Phase 3, located in Poland, NATO says it will be put into use in the year 2018. This would cover the Baltic Sea, quite a big areas, 3 of them over there. You can see on the map. There we go. Mr. Kulesa, the distrust is there. So the question is, should we proceed more with the distrust by building more of these systems, and phase 2 and phase 3 completed all of them without Russia's input? Or should we take a step back and think how trust can be created? Mr. Kulesa.
It's funny because we discuss trust and we discuss arms control, but one of the main tenets of arms control is trust, but verify. And the funny part is that we actually been in some discussions with Russia in 2009, 2010 about ways in which we can increase transparency of the sites. And there were discussions about allowing Russians to actually enter these installations and check what is behind every missile canister, whether it is a defense weapon or an offensive Tomahawk cruise missiles. And at that point, unfortunately, the Russian side decided that they want to play for more. They want to play for a co-decision over deployment of this system. And that was a bit too far for the United States and NATO. But let's remember that these proposals were on the table. But about the future, right now NATO looks very much united, and Russia helped a lot with its very dangerous rhetoric and some actions. So I would see the two sides being built and operational, but at the same time, I don't see personally any willingness in NATO to go beyond that, to go anything that would actually put the Russian strategic forces under the threat. So NATO is doing what it's planning to do and what it said it would do, but doesn't really at this point want to go any further.
Well, Mr. Kulesa, talk about united NATO. That's an interesting message, given the fact that the economies of many of those European countries are suffering a lot. There's a lot of responsibilities being kicked around as to who should provide the money for a future buildup of the military. But let me come back to you, Ambassador Volker, before we go. What about the U.S. Relations with Russia? If trust is not being built, is there any likeness of trust being built by the current administration likely to leave the office very soon? And of course, you have presidential campaign likely to go on very soon in your country as well. Meanwhile, let me just mention another factor that it seems Washington is challenging Russia militarily, while at the same time sending certain kinds of military message to China as well. Many wonder what would that mean for Washington to challenge another two big nations as well when it comes to defense. Very briefly from you, Ambassador Volker.
Sure. So point one, the United States is not challenging Russia. Russia is invading neighbors, occupying territory, annexing territory, and threatening NATO countries. And part of the job of NATO is collective self-defense.
Right.
So we've had to reverse the trend in the massive declines in Europe in defense capabilities in order to be capable of protecting NATO allies. In Asia, as we've talked about in other conversations, China is also changing its approach to its territorial claims, and that has caused some rising tensions. The U.S. is trying to just maintain what had been a very stable situation over a long period.